How can we build a sustainable future without fossil fuels? In 4 episodes, we cover everything from the US shale boom to renewables and energy security, and focus on the Strait of Hormuz and what the rising China means for the energy markets. And today, we address a real hot topic, the Strait of Hormuz and Iran's growing role in the energy markets. This is the Evolution Show. Welcome to the Evolution Show. I'm your host Johan Landgren. The Evolution Show is all about connecting the dots to see the bigger picture and address some of the biggest challenges and opportunities of our time. We focus on smart energy solutions, electric transports, artificial intelligence, AI, climate, and of course, inspiration for sustainable living. In the previous episode, we talked about the oil market and our oil addiction. And today, we address a real hot topic, the Strait of Hormuz, and Iran's increased importance for the energy markets. On Thursday, we talk about what a rising China means for the energy markets. To help me, I've invited a real energy expert, Mikael Höök. To learn more about Mikael, see the previous episode or the descriptions below. So let's get to it. Here's part 2 of our energy series. Just before I let you speak here, I would like to mention the Strait of Hormuz because it's a hot topic right now, and it's very important to understand the trading routes, what role it plays as a trading route in the world. So perhaps you can elaborate a little bit, why is the Strait of Hormuz so important, and what's Iran's role in the energy market?
I would say that the Strait of Hormuz is known as probably the world's most important choke point for international oil trade. And it's a fairly thin strait between Iran and the Arabic Peninsula. And within that pretty thin strait, a lot of oil is being transported, typically by tankers from Saudi Arabia, Iran, Qatar and so on, going to the world market. So we have a very narrow strait where something like 20 to 25 million tons, million barrels of oil is passing every day. So it is a very significant problem if something were to put a stranglehold on that strait, and it would prevent quite significant volumes of oil from reaching the world markets and all the consumers that desperately need their oil.
Yeah, and that's just to say, put it in a context, that's about 30% of the world oil production that's being shipped in a very narrow passage. I think I read it's around, in reality there are 2 directions, the shipping directions the ships the oil tankers can take, and it's only 3 kilometers wide each. So and if you look at how big these tankers are and how much traffic that's coming there, you just realize that a lot of things can happen if you have a slightest conflict of any kind or a disruption of the shipping.
And it has been a concern from geopolitical reasons for quite many decades, where they would fear that maybe a single problematic state could put mines or something, or essentially just block the Strait of Hormuz and prevent something like 30% of world oil supply from entering the markets. And that would lead to a very significant energy crisis, and probably very significant price responses as well from the trading.
Yeah, and also to clarify for those who are not following the energy market, normally you talk about reserve capacity, like that you have maybe a couple of percent or a couple of million barrels, perhaps 1.5. I haven't the latest figure now, but I think it's something, let's say it's about between 2 or a maximum 3 million barrels if you just squeeze out everything extra that you have in Saudi Arabia or in the US together. But we're talking about 30% of the whole shipping if it's totally closed. But it's more complicated than that, and I think it's interesting to just look at different perspectives here. Of course, we have the Western world looking at sanctions and so on, and we are all fearing a disruption of the trading route, both for shipping for oil, but in general in this very important region. But Iran is in there. If I take the their position. You also realize that they need to ship their oil. And they're very dependent on their shipping. They have about 4.7 million barrels per day, and that's about 5% of the world market. But what's not mentioned when we talk about Iran is that they have the second biggest natural gas reserve in the world. Almost 2.5 times the US natural gas reserves. And number one is, of course, Russia. But they're not exporting that much. They're the third biggest, I think, LNG or natural gas exporter at this time, and very much so to shipping a lot of that to China. So perhaps we should talk a little bit about that as well, because
and if we just look at this graph, we can see that, for instance, Iran has been a quite steady supplier of oil to the world market for many decades, remaining essentially flat at around 5% of world oil supply since 1980s. And there are, of course, some dips connected to political turmoils and general economic recessions, but not very much has happened with their market share of world oil. But if you look at natural gas, we see a very significant increase with Iran growing from almost a quite insignificant 1% of world gas supply to a bit more than 6% at the moment. So they are really developing and becoming much more of an important supplier of natural gas. And most of the Iranian gas is being pipelined to Turkey and Europe. They do not really have any LNG of their own, but they still have a lot of more or less control over LNG. In Qatar, they primarily ship their natural gas with LNG to Asia Pacific. And if the Strait of Hormuz would be blocked, so would the gas supply of many Asia Pacific countries as well be.
So that, it's interesting. But also I think it's important to remember that different oils have different importance or different meaning, roles on the market. So the shale oil in the US is a very light crude, it's called, and a slight heavier, or quite a lot of heavier, I guess you could say, is the Iranian oil, but also and very much heavier is the Venezuelan unconventional oil. They have both conventional and unconventional, as I understand it. So Iran has a role to play there as well. If you keep it to Iran here, they mix, for example, a lot of Iranian oil is mixed with US oil, for example, or can be mixed. And I know that US are importing Venezuelan oil to mix with their shale oil in order to make gasoline and diesel and so on. So how is Iran and also perhaps Venezuela, but Iran playing in that part, do you think?
I would say that it's definitely important, but part of that trade is also very much connected to specific oil refineries, and the only consumers of crude oil we have in the world is actually refineries, because no one else is actually using it for anything. And bilateral deals with one country and another country can, for instance, supply the right type of oil for a specific refinery. And if you construct your refinery for medium heavy Ural blend oil from Russia, then you can process it quite efficiently, but that do not automatically make your refinery capable of processing very light and sweet crude oil from the North Sea, for instance. So it is important to match your refinery capacity and your refinery technology with the kind of oil you can get access to, and partly you can mitigate that by blending, as you stated, and that is important as well, to essentially make sure that the oil you get to your refineries is fairly matched with the refining capacity and technology you have access to. And
you have other producers, I guess, that Saudi Arabia has a similar kind of oil, and others that could supply the market if something happened. But we haven't talked about Venezuela, but a little bit. I think it's good to elaborate on that as well, because it's very much economic and political turmoil, but they're still considered to have the biggest oil reserves in the world. And that's, you mentioned the difference between unconventional and conventional oil, but as I understand it, it's unconventional heavy oil that these numbers are based on. So the current situation, they are basically last year, I think their decline of production was 20%, something like that, 23%. and it's not even half of what it was 10 years ago. But still, you always mention that they have huge reserves. How should we look at Venezuela when it comes to these numbers?
Well, I would say that their numbers are usually something that is just on a paper. I would not really see them as being realistically developed on a large scale in the foreseeable future. We will probably have commercial fusion power before we see a large-scale development of Venezuelan extra heavy oil from the Orinoco Belt. So it is pretty far into the future, and it is very much connected to the general political development of the country of Venezuela, and what will happen there in the future is, of course, hard to make any probability forecast for, but I would say that it's at least 10-20 years before we see any significant production that would be of major importance for the world supply.
Yeah. But okay, so right now you can maybe call it a stalemate in the conflict. It's like you have, for example, the Swedish-owned and British-flagged Stina Imperial ship that was sized in the Strait of Hormuz in July 19th. And it was seen as a response to the British capture of the Iranian tanker Grace 1 in Gibraltar. I'm not going to go into the details of all this, but from now, I think, I mean, just to clarify, the Strait of Hormuz is very central.
Yeah.
And could you maybe, have you thought about how this conflict could develop? Do you think it's going to be kind of a balance where they reach the conclusion that there is no point either from the Iranian side or the Western side, or could it be a conflict based on misconceptions, which is often the case?
Yeah, I would say that there is a risk for both, actually. What we currently see is something like a lot of saber rattling, and some people have even compared it a bit to a chicken race, where both sides is trying to act quite tough and hoping that the other will kind of stop doing the thing they are not supposed to do. But I would say that in the background we also need to remember the Carter Doctrine. In the US, they have since 1970s had this statement that any outsiders that want to affect the Middle East would be seen as a very significant attack on the vital interests of the US. And that has been used to, for instance, justify the interventions in Iraq and so on, and it is fully possible that the Carter Doctrine, that is very important in the US middle policy, could be used to, for instance, justify some kind of military intervention against Iran if they decide to block or challenge too much of the vital US interests in the region.
Yeah. So, but in reality, let's really hope that won't happen. But it's possible that we could have a conflict that's escalating. You mean, that's your point. Yeah.
And I would say that the escalation of that conflict is very much connected to the kind of decision makers on both sides and what they actually choose to do in the future. So it's uncertain, and it's probably good to be prepared for the worst and hope for the best.
Yeah. But would you like to elaborate anything on how this could happen? Do you think would it be that I mean, in reality, what would it mean if it's closed? Would it be closed temporarily, and then would just have the U.S. fleet going in to open it up to enable trade, or could you have a situation that you mentioned mines? There it's easy for Iran, for example, to put mines on the bottom or something like that.
Yeah, but the strait is also so narrow, so you can reach it with artillery pieces, you can reach it with short range rockets and so on. So it is really challenging to defend the entire strait, and it is pretty easy for Iran to have some kind of military equipment that could potentially harm them, and this is exactly what they have threatened to do. If US or anyone is doing something military against them, they would automatically defend themselves by blocking the Strait of Hormuz.
So I think we should end by saying it's a lose-lose in this situation. No one will win from closing the Strait of Hormuz. No. So let's hope for better negotiations on all terms, on all ports, I think. So, okay, but just I think we touched upon Iran's oil production and natural gas. So, and also just something to mention is that China, they have increased their LNG or liquefied natural gas with 38% in 2018 alone. And that's quite an incredible number. and they stood for 70% of the world's liquefied natural gas. So clearly what's happening, if you look at the global trends, going back to that, natural gas is playing an increasing importance on the energy market. What do you think about natural gas in general, and perhaps also if you think about a little bit about Iran and other big natural gas producers for the future?
Yeah, I would say that globally we are seeing quite many countries making a push for more natural gas. And of course it's very understandable from a technical point of view, because natural gas is both cleaner and it is quite easy to process and distribute and so on within countries. So this is why many countries are trying to phase out traditional biofuels or dirty coal and so on, and replace it by cleaner natural gas. And this is what they're trying to do in China, and this is one of the things that we can see quite a lot in the US as well, with the US coal industry almost going on its knees, and it's mostly being replaced by this enormous glut of shale gas that is being extracted, and more or less all coal-fired power stations closing down or being converted into natural gas-fired power plants.
I would just contradict you a little bit there. I would say that the research is, as I understand, is not 100% sure that it's cleaner than coal. It depends on different. So I would just put that in, because we don't know about emissions that we can't see, and there are also not so much data.
Yeah, so I would completely agree with that picture, but the picture that many decision makers are following is that essentially shale gas or natural gas is cleaner than coal. Absolutely. And this usually just focuses on the direct emissions, all forms of fugitive methane releases from gas fields, or shale gas is usually not accounted for.
No,
and
or shale oil. Yeah, exactly. No, exactly. Yeah, so that's a good thing to mention, that I mean, we need to move away from fossil fuels as much as possible in general. So, just to make that point, that natural gas is not a general solution either. But
I would also say that it depends a bit on the kind of goals decision makers are pursuing. If we look at, for instance, household air pollution, it is primarily traditional biofuels, wood and so on, that is causing something like 7 to 8 million people to die prematurely every year. And in many countries they see almost any form of fossil fuel as way cleaner than traditional biofuels, and this is why they are subsidizing it or encouraging people to go to switch from traditional wood stoves to, for instance, natural gas fired things. So it is a very complicated question of development.
Yeah, and I think you raise a good point. I think the difference between local emissions can be very different from the global emissions. So you have to make a distinction there to clarify what you mean. So that's a good point. And just to mention that in terms of our natural gas consumption, it has increased last year. And it was both, if you talk about, let's see here, the natural gas grew by almost 18%, while coal consumption increased with less than 1% actually, and oil consumption grew by 5%, just to get a general picture of what happened. But they all grew. Interestingly, in the report, BP Statistical Review, the editor said that this was concerning, because not only if you look at the greenhouse emissions, but this year we had a lower last year, 2018, we had a lower economic activity. So they were not expecting this kind of rise. But then he pointed out that they clearly could see that the natural gas consumption was increasing. And that was related to extreme weather events, both cold days and warm days. And even if we don't say that this is because of greenhouse emissions, if this will continue the next couple of years, our ability to change the curve in terms of keeping to the Paris Agreement will be very difficult. So I would just like to mention that. But
it's also connected to many other trends of development. If you, for instance, look at electrification rate, last year was pretty important, because it was the first time where less than 1 billion people didn't really have access to electricity. But sadly, more than 70% of all people that got access to electricity since year 2000 has received it using fossil fuel-based electricity. So we also see a very significant lock-in to fossil fuels in terms of connecting new people to the grid and energy markets. So we do not really see this switch to green energy, mostly just a lock-in with coal-based electricity, because it remains the cheapest way of producing large amounts of power in many countries and many parts of the world.
If you enjoyed this conversation, feel free to continue the conversation in the comments below. On Thursday, we turn our focus to the rising China and what it means for the energy markets. If you want to see the videos as soon as they come out, consider subscribing. As always, we appreciate your feedback. Was it good or bad? I hope to see you on Thursday for the next episode.